Good morning, people. We're back on it. Right, so general plan is I think we end up with about kind of 5 more weeks until we break up, something along those lines. It's looking like we will have some face-to-face contact with you in a couple of weeks, but it won't be full classes, but we can use that towards kind of getting coursework drafted and things. So what we're aiming to get done by the end of the kind of term is to kind of deal through the rest of the primary history in Brodie so we can get that second coursework draft sorted. We also want to just kind of break that up slightly with kind of setting you up ready for that kind of wider reading around the American lit as well. So the plan for this week, I'm just going to, because it's been a couple of weeks, link back into the questions, remind you of the questions that you're working towards to start with. Then just a quick recall activity based on the kind of aphorisms sheet that's going to be in the email I'm sending to you with this. Then today we'll focus on kind of Mary, how she is depicted as kind of marginalised, the way that Spark kind of suggests the underlying reasons for that. Primarily linking that into the kind of teachers as abusive and the kind of dangers of education question. Tomorrow we're focused more around the educational system and how it kind of sort of appears to promote the marginalisation of the poor. Again, linking Brodie herself into that, so it's also going to link into the kind of teachers as abusers question. I'm going to set up some kind of reading homework for next week because next week one of the lessons we'll look at the kind of defeat of Brodie, essentially, the way that fascism plays a part of it. So those kind of dangerous ideas entering the classroom and then being potentially kind of destructive. On Friday, I'm going to kind of bring in a wider reading focus to the session. So I'm going to look at another short story, an American short story that you could use as your wider reading, and just link that in at that point. So in terms of this, just again, I'm not going to do this for hours, just a reminder, those are the questions that you're working towards, okay? You don't need to have decided on them yet, but I think it really helps if you've got a kind of firm idea in mind of exactly what you're going to be answering. So remember, first one, it's the dangers of education as a whole. The second one, it's more focused around the ways in which teachers influences becomes abusive, and then it's gender and sexual dynamics. So you've got essentially here 3 different questions. There's crossover between them. As I say, just keep them in mind. They're the lens through which we're analysing the 2 texts, okay? And the other thing to remember, just again, as we're looking at this, as we're working on the stuff from today, it's the only assessment that you're going to do across the exams, across the coursework, where all 5 assessment objectives are being marked. So we mentioned this right back when we first started doing it. You know, you've got AO1 for your arguments and terminology. You're going to have to do language analysis in this one, alongside bringing in context, comparing the 2 texts, and linking in different views and criticism and things like this alongside, okay? So again, just bear that in mind. So the first thing we're going to kind of link back into aphorisms. We mentioned this with when we were looking at Polonius, back when we were looking at Hamlet. So you should remember roughly what an aphorism is, and think about the implications with Polonius. What I want you to do quickly to start off with, remind yourself of this. You want to remember what is an aphorism, because we're going to link this into Brodie as well. It's a piece of terminology that we can potentially kind of apply to it. Okay, so essentially what an aphorism is it's sort of a kind of statement of seeming universal truth. and generally people pick them up from kind of classical authors. They're kind of and they borrow them and use them themselves. Now, the reason that it's important in terms of Polonius at certain points seems to kind of make a lot of sense. He seems kind of intelligent. However, the fact that he's talking in aphorisms suggests that there's no originality to his thought. Whilst he's just spouting these old aphorisms that in many ways have now become cliched. So they kind of reflect on whether Polonius has got any kind of genuine insight or not, or any kind of individual approach to it. Now, when we kind of apply this into Brodie, there's a number of kind of repeated phrases, those kind of, and I've called them kind of seeming aphorisms, because she kind of presents them as aphorisms, presents them as having universal truth, but we as the reader kind of call that into question. So I thought this would be a good way to kind of start back into looking at Brodie, just to go back through those kind of repeated and kind of words, and thinking about how they reflect onto the character of Brodie, her aims, her intentions, and what she's kind of setting out to do, or what Spark intends that we kind of understand by that, and allows us to kind of discuss it. Okay, so what you've got alongside the email, there's a sheet, and it essentially is just kind of a list of these kind of either repeated phrases or things that are more aphoristic. All I want you to do is when you spend 10 minutes, go down the sheet, look at those kind of bits of dialogue by Brodie, think about what they imply in terms of her kind of characterization, in terms of kind of what Spark's exploring about her, and her kind of intentions. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at these. As I say, it's just to start us off, then our primary focus is going to kind of switch to Mary, and how she's kind of depicted in the novel. Okay, so we've got the first one. I'm putting old heads on young shoulders. This appears like a kind of statement of intent from Brodie, and this one it's a little bit kind of aphoristic potentially. It's definitely not Brodie who's the first kind of person to use this, and the implication appears to be something good. The idea that she's pushing her students. At the same time, you could talk about this and how it kind of implies potentially that she's pushing them beyond their kind of the capacity of their age group, and this can be kind of applied into the way she introduces them to kind of ideas around sex much earlier than potentially we would kind of deem appropriate. Then we've got her kind of repeated that she's going to kind of make them the creme de la creme. We can talk about this as a metaphor. This is kind of maybe less aphoristic. There's no kind of seeming universal, truth to it. But it implies a kind of superiority that Brodie kind of seeks after. It implies something kind of, maybe conventionally feminine about it as well. The idea of the cream of the cream, the kind of the cream, the top of the cream, something kind of sweet and almost sickly to it. There's a plot to force me to resign. Again, this is simply a recurring kind of idea within the text, but it shows that Brodie is kind of a maverick. Brodie is different to the rest of the teaching staff. This kind of repeated idea of conflict that comes into it, and a sense of kind of paranoia that's maybe suggested within it. Then we've got, obviously, the whole novel's called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. You have this repeated and recurring statement, I'm in my prime, I'm dedicated to you in my prime. This is something that comes up again and again across the novel. And it, again, you can kind of link this in the ambiguity of what she means by her prime, that kind of prime time of life, the prime in terms of her sexuality, and the fact that Spark suggests there's a kind of irony to this as well, in the while she kind of states that she's in her prime, she's actually kind of restricted in many ways, kind of around this. So she's not necessarily able to live out her prime. Then we get to one that definitely is more kind of aphoristic. Safety does not come first. Goodness, truth, and beauty come first. Now, this again is another kind of, it's repeated a couple of times in the novel. It kind of comes in where Brodie is talking about the kind of the different subject pathways that the students could choose. And I think it's an important one because it shows that Spark wants us to see Brodie as kind of focusing on outer image. There's a sense of kind of the typical feminine to this, but the outer image and aesthetics come before the safety of the students, potentially. For the sake of appearances and aesthetics, she doesn't mind about the kind of risks that the students take. Then we've got our other ones. So we get speech is silver, but silence is golden. Again, another repeated statement a couple of times across the novel. It's, again, not necessarily Brodie herself, it's aphoristic again. And the idea that she seeks their silence, there's a kind of, if you were making a point about grooming, potentially this could come into it. The fact that on one level she's supposedly teaching them to have a sense of individuality, to kind of think, but the reality is that she's the one kind of pushing her ideas upon them. What we got next? Yeah, art is greater than science. Art comes first and then science. Again, another kind of repeated phrase throughout the novel. Again, it cuts into the kind of more aphoristic here, and again suggests that Brodie values appearance over practicality, that those two conflicting ideas of art versus science hold two kind of notions underlying them, and for Brodie, the aesthetic quality is more important. Again, another one that we kind of, a lot of people remember. Again, this is definitely a more kind of aphoristic one. Or at least the latter part of it is. It means a leading out. To me, education as a leading out is what is already there in a pupil's soul. And she criticises Miss Mackey as the head teacher of kind of putting things in instead of kind of leading out. Now, again, it's presented by Brodie as kind of an aphorism. It suggests a kind of universal truth. It suggests what she desires to do, even. But Spark wants us to see this kind of ironically, because if you read the novel, it's quite clear that Brodie is not leading out from the kind of students. She's actually imposing upon them. She is imposing her views and her ideals upon them. There is no real leading out from them at all. Last few of these little ones to start us off. Phrases like team spirit are always employed to cut across individualism, love, and personal loyalties. Again, presented like an aphorism, a statement, kind of universal truth here. Again, Spark creates a kind of irony because Brodie is supposedly promoting individualism at the same time as kind of creating the Brodie set. So there's a hypocrisy that's being depicted within Brodie through statements like this that Spark kind of gives to her. And then the last one, this becomes less aphoristic, although, yeah, less aphoristic in terms of this one, but it's a repeated phrase that kind of comes later on in the novel, kind of several times. Do you know, Sander dear, all my ambitions are for you and Rose? And this one kind of simply reflects the way that Spark wants to see kind of Brodie as essentially living through the students, that her ambitions are tied up with them. She's living vicariously her own life, her own restricted life through them, and this leads into obviously the affair. So I think useful way to start us off to remind ourselves of the text, just to go over those kind of repeated phrases, because they capture a lot of ideas within the text. They tell us a lot about Brodie as a kind of character and figure. Now, the next thing we want is Mary McGregor. Okay. Now, I'm going to get you to use the sheet where I've just kind of cut down a number of what I see as kind of key sections in relation to Mary McGregor and her characterization that comes into this. Just for the sake of time, there's other bits within the novel that you could potentially use, and I'm going to go over it as kind of quickly as I can, otherwise the video will turn into kind of several hours long as well. Now, Mary's a kind of an important character within this, in that we can talk about the way in which she's used to show the potentially the labelling of intelligence and kind of prospects in the educational system as a whole, and kind of pushed by Brodie as well, can show the kind of damage in the long term to a kind of a student and their kind of their future, their kind of mentality, essentially. Now, you can debate around this. You could look at the way in which this is, maybe for a modern audience presented as a potential problem, whereas, at certain points within the narrative voice actually appears to kind of almost support this treatment of Mary. So you could link that in as well. It's, there's a degree of debate that goes with this. Now, I'm going to want you to go through the key extracts that I put on the sheet, and I want you to kind of bear certain kind of questions in mind as you're looking at them. So they're on the sheet as well at the top, but you want to kind of be thinking here and linking back into Spark and her intentions. Does Spark suggest that Mary is deserving of her treatment? So is this something that's been kind of pushed upon Mary, or is it something that's been kind of, she deserves, she's brought upon herself, essentially? Do you, as a reader, kind of sympathize with Mary as a character, or are you kind of placed in a position where you join in the mockery of her? Now, as Spark's kind of looking at this, she kind of explores why people do this to Mary as well. What is it that kind of causes this to happen? So think about how she's kind of bringing that in. We've talked, when we've looked at Brodie before, about ideas of prolepsis, so where the novel kind of flashes forwards in time. Now, we know that Mary kind of dies in this fire, so think as well about how Mary's death is potentially connected to the way that she's treated in school as part of it. I want you to think whether Spark suggests that this is kind of a purely educational problem, or whether this is something maybe slightly broader. And all the way through, as you're looking at Mary, I would be trying to think about how Mary can be compared to Rudge. Okay, now you're not, as you think about this, just to kind of bear this in mind, you're not always thinking about similarities as well. You should be thinking about differences. So I'll start to kind of outline it now, but start to pick up on it yourself. Think in terms of the way that Rudge is kind of, or start again, how Alan Bennett kind of suggests that there is a kind of intelligence to Rudge. There's a kind of understanding to him. He creates kind of irony around this kind of labelling to him. It's not necessarily going to be the same way in terms of how Spark presents Mary. There's no kind of hidden intellect necessarily behind Mary in quite the same way. Okay. Now, as you look at it, just in a minute I'll let you have a look at it, but I just want you to bear in mind you need terminology to go alongside this. You need to be looking at the methods in which Spark is kind of exploring this. So here on it, I've kind of pointed out a number of bits of terminology that you kind of might apply as you go through. I'll pick up on some of these as I'm kind of talking around it. So have a look and try and think how you could work these into your discussion. So you should be thinking how the narrative voice and its omniscience explores this marginalisation of Mary, how that opens up these views of it. You should be looking for kind of metaphors and similes as you go through. You should be thinking about how the dialogue is constructed, how the different utterances kind of shape this appearance of Mary, and things like this, because we're looking to kind of utilize all these different assessment objectives, or kind of get the marks for these different assessment objectives in at the kind of discussion. Okay, so what I would suggest to kind of read through to properly annotate with those kind of key questions in mind is probably going to take you at least kind of half an hour, if not a bit longer, to do a kind of good job of going through and analysing this depiction of Mary McGregor. Okay, as I say, on the email there's the sheet with the guidance points and with some number of key extracts. I want you to look at it yourselves first, have a proper kind of analyse of it, because I'm not going to pull out every feature of it as well. Last piece of advice before you start looking at it, try to think about kind of the structure within it. So how certain ideas across the kind of little extracts kind of connected, what kind of things Spark is placing side by side, and what the implication is as well, about kind of the characterization of Mary. Okay, so pause it here. You should be spending a decent amount of time going through it yourself. Then I will go through some kind of key points with it. Okay. Okay, so the first one comes from the very start of the novel itself, and it's the way in which Mary is kind of first introduced to us. Now, she's introduced in many ways in a similar fashion to the rest of the Brodie set. There's kind of, she's famous for something, sort of implying that other people know her for this kind of trait. And her fame rests on her being a kind of silent lump, a nobody whom everybody could blame. Now, there's a kind of viciousness to these metaphors. The narrative voice is kind of seemingly disdainful of her, or at least it shows that other people are disdainful of her. She's a silent lump and nobody. So it kind of suggests there's no real sense of kind of identity to her. It does start to explore the reasons why she's kind of depicted in this way. She becomes a kind of scapegoat and a figure of blame. Now, with this one, it's important to kind of consider what kind of structurally happens in the novel as a whole, as it kind of progresses. So a lot of these girls who are supposedly famous for certain things, as the novel progresses, it kind of undermines this. So if you take Rose Stanley, who is famous for sex, as the novel progresses, it's made clear that while she's supposedly famous for this, and Brodie kind of projects onto her and says she's got a kind of instinct for it, she herself has absolutely zero interest in the way that's implied about her. So these labels and these judgments are very often kind of undermined as the novel kind of progresses. So you could talk about how those wider kind of proleptic leaps and those other kind of insights into other characters may suggest that this depiction of Mary too is not necessarily as legitimate as it maybe initially appears. Now, the second one I picked is the incident from kind of the start of the novel again in the classroom, and it does a couple of different things, that you kind of talk around. Now, the first again is the fact that you've got this kind of the disdain of the narrative voice again. It seemingly is kind of quite shocking in the way it attacks Mary McGregor. Again, she sat lump-like, so you could talk about the kind of simile here. She's too stupid to invent something, so you've got the kind of the intensifier. She's too stupid. She was too stupid to tell a lie, so that kind of repetition of it as well, that kind of repeated structure. Now, there is that kind of disdain, and yes, she is kind of depicted as kind of stupid in a sense. She's hiding a comic that she's reading when she's not supposed to be, and Brodie has kind of pointed that out. So it's kind of like you lot trying to go on your mobile phone in the middle of a lesson. She's doing it with a comic book instead. Now, there's a mockery here. So think about the dialogue, the kind of the utterances from Brodie. Do you mean a comedian, a droll, and everybody tittered? So there's this kind of collective mockery of Mary in this classroom setting that's being depicted. And there's this kind of deliberate antagonism from Brodie, a comic paper, forsooth, how old are you? So there's almost that kind of deliberate elevation, that kind of more archaic language that suggests, you know, a teacher mocking a student deliberately in a kind of more vicious way. And the confiscation of it, there's kind of a harshness to this. You are too old for comic papers, give it to me. Now, the important thing to kind of consider here is that Mary has been singled out. The narrative voice seems to be a kind of an accomplice in this. The narrative voice too seems to depict her as kind of stupid. But at the same time, if you look at the last bit of this extract, perceiving all eyes upon it, she lifted it out of the basket, tore it up beyond redemption, and put it back in again. Now, this is an interesting kind of touch for Spark to put in there, because it suggests that whilst Mary has been kind of singled out, all the other students also kind of desire this comic book. They too are interested in this comic book. So it both suggests she's been marked out, but also that she's not really so different from the rest of them as is kind of potentially being made out as part of it. So Spark herself may be kind of creating an irony around the kind of whole event. Okay, so the next one kind of is one of those proleptic leaps forward, and it deals with Mary and kind of the future and the death of Mary, essentially. And unlike potentially some of the earlier ones, this extract maybe evokes more of a sense of pity for Mary. There's a sense of kind of tragedy around her. You get the kind of depiction of the sort of the betrayal by this kind of her first and only boyfriend, and the fact that despite the kind of cruelty inflicted upon her, these were the happiest days of her life, those times in kind of Brodie's classroom. So there's a kind of, you know, the superlative nature to it. They're the happiest days of her life, despite the kind of small cruelties that Spark juxtaposes with this. So you get a kind of who has spilled ink on the floor? Was it you, Mary? I don't know, Miss Brodie. So those bits of dialogue serve to kind of create the irony here, or to kind of heighten this sense of irony of this being the happiest days. And the dialogue's important. So if you look at kind of Brodie's utterance, there's the assumption that it's Mary. She doesn't know it's Mary, but there's, you know, Spark suggests it's an automatic assumption. Was it you, Mary? And then the kind of the way in which she's attacked following on from this. I dare say it was you. I've never come across such a clumsy girl. And this kind of undermining becomes something that the audience potentially, or the reader potentially sees as something quite vicious. And potentially it connects into the way she's kind of depicted in her kind of dying here. So you get this depiction of her in a kind of dying in a hotel fire, And there's something almost idiotic about her death itself. There's something directionless symbolized through it. She simply runs backwards and forwards between the smoke and the flames until she kind of passes out and dies. And in her death, she's silent there as well. She heard no screams from the roar of the fire, drowned the scream. She gave no scream, for the smoke was choking her. Now, just like she's given no direction really in her educational life. She's simply kind of shunted backwards and forwards, and she's never really given a voice. And again, this links into her death as well. So there is a kind of potential suggestion of consequence here that Spark is kind of building up, that we can connect between the two. Okay, so the next one kind of there's a couple of different extracts that cut across that journey through the town, and the way that Mary is kind of depicted within this. Now, think about the first one again, the way in which the dialogue is constructed to suggest that there is a kind of, again, a viciousness and a kind of, something cruel about the way that Brodie's dialogue is depicted. Sandy cannot talk to you if you're so stupid and disagreeable. Again, the adjectives here applied to Mary and their kind of open nature. There's a kind of a demeaning and undermining, a labeling of Mary, and we could look at this as kind of promoting a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell somebody that they're stupid often enough, they come to believe it themselves, and eventually they'll kind of, suffer for it. And dun, 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 it kind of develops. So if you look at the kind of second one, I'm not going to pull much more out of the first bit of that. But hang on. Yeah, sorry. As it kind of progresses, for a moment, Sandy wants to be kind of kind to Mary. Now, this is one of those occasions where the omniscience of the narrative voice becomes quite important, because it's into the different mindsets of the characters. It can see into their minds and explore the kind of motivation. So that omniscience is important in doing that, and that's something you can talk about, how that omniscient narrator is used. And you get this, then suddenly Sandy wanted to be kind to Mary McGregor and thought of the possibilities of feeling nice and being nice to Mary instead of blaming her. So there's a desire to kind of be nice to her, but the omniscience reveals the kind of reasons why she kind of shifts back to that kind of more insulting, more demeaning mode. And Brodie is placed in the centre of this. So Miss Brodie's voice from behind was saying to Rose Stanley, and you just get the bit of dialogue, the sound of Miss Brodie's presence just when it was on the tip of Sandy's tongue to be nice to Mary McGregor arrested the urge. And Miss Brodie's presence here is kind of personified. It's her presence that stops the kindness to Mary that could, potentially change the individual's life. So Brodie as a teacher is presented in a kind of destructive light. She's kind of, promoting this kind of abuse essentially. She's kind of a stumbling block is what Spark is kind of depicting here. And hang on, let me pick out the other bits as well. Okay, so you get the way in which Spark kind of implies an insight from Sandy, and you get this kind of image. She understood them as a body with Miss Brodie at his head, and they are kind of in a unified compliance to the destiny of Miss Brodie. So they're kind of turned into the Brodie set. They're dictated to by her, that the rest of them, in terms of this kind of metaphor, is simply an extension of Brodie and her will. And then as it goes on, it kind of explores the desire to essentially remain part of the group. So this abuse, this kind of nature that Brodie has kind of promoted, is linked into this, that the temptation to be nice to Mary McGregor. So it's almost presented in kind of, deviant terms to be nice to her. Would it would break this kind of, so for good fellowship's sake, and there's a kind of irony to what follows, she insults her. So to maintain this kind of group cohesion, she says basically, if Jenny was here, I wouldn't be talking to you. I don't like you very much. Sorry, you then get kind of Mary crying and crying silently to kind of hide this, so the pain that this evokes. But it all links into Brodie. It all links into what Brodie's done, the way in which Brodie has kind of created this kind of set and this system, the way that Brodie has promoted this victimization of Mary McGregor. So if we're linking this into the different questions, we've got, again, that labelling of her within an educational environment. You've also got Brodie and her influence turning into abuse, where she is the one kind of promoting the abuse of Mary, not necessarily directly, but it's her that's kind of changing the mindset of the other students as well. Here we note that it's Sandy. Okay, then we get the incident as kind of depicted within the music. No, not the music room, sorry, the art room. It's something we've kind of briefly discussed before in relation to the kind of repressed sexuality of the adult figures within the narrative, but we're taking a kind of slightly different tact with it this time. So what we've got here, all of them, the entire class is depicted as kind of amused, as kind of uncertain around kind of Mr. Lloyd's kind of lecture to them. But it's, once again, it's Mary that's kind of singled out, that Brodie singles out and uses as a kind of as an example, as a scapegoat, as a way in which to exert control over the others. So if you look at kind of this bit, it focuses in on kind of, again, Mary's stupidity. So it does suggest an aspect of kind of legitimacy to this treatment. Mary's giggles have been caused by contagion, for she was too stupid to have any sex wits of her own. So there is within that kind of metaphor of the kind of contagion, the kind of idea that she's simply laughing because others are laughing. But it certainly points out that she isn't the ringleader she's kind of made out to be. And Brodie's eyes kind of metaphorically fix on her. That Miss Brodie grasped Mary's arm, jerked her to her feet, propelled her to the door. So think about our verb choices here. They all kind of evoke a kind of, not violence is probably kind of over exaggerated, but there's certainly something kind of vicious within it almost, as she kind of propels her out. And the implication kind of works, or the action works, in that the violent action sobered the girls. So it's, her victimization of Mary here is depicted as a form of control, and it works. It sobers the rest of them metaphorically, but it's it made them feel, in the official sense, an unwanted ringleader had been apprehended and there was no longer in the wrong. So there's a kind of irony being evoked here. If you look at that little subordinate clause within the middle of the sentence, in the official sense, it does suggest that in the real sense, there is no ringleader here. Mary isn't deserving of it, but in the kind of official condoned sense, this is what has kind of happened. Sorry, pardon me. Okay, then we have our next one, in which they've moved beyond Brodie's classroom and they've moved into the kind of the science classroom. Now, this one's important because it connects Mary's death with her experiences in school. So you get the kind of description within this anecdote of the kind of science experiment and Mary's response to this. and she's simply kind of running backwards and forwards in exactly the same way as she's depicted in her kind of death scene earlier on in the narrative. So it kind of suggests that her experiences within an educational setting have maybe linked with the way that she dies. Again, you can argue here that there's, a sense of legitimacy to the way she's treated. It's not just Miss Brodie that kind of sees her and labels her in this way. Miss Lockhart is depicted in the same way, who had already learnt the exasperation of looking at Mary's face, its 2 eyes, nose and mouth, with nothing more to say about it. But there is a sense of guilt that's evoked that follows again. So you get a kind of proleptic leap then to the kind of future, and you get various different kind of comments through the dialogue of, I wish they'd been nicer to her, which again suggests that they see a connection between the way that she's been mocked and marginalised as a child and the way in which she kind of dies or ends up kind of as an adult. Right, then we get our last couple people. So again, we get another proleptic leap forward. We get Brodie kind of in her kind of aged state looking back earlier on. And again, we get that sense of her as having labelled Mary. She was a little pathetic. And then you get that kind of conjunction, that shift. But she's really the most irritating girl. I'd rather deal with a rogue and a fool. And I thought that there might be something to her. So that idea that she's been kind of labelled right from the outset as somebody stupid, a fool, and there's no idea of kind of lifting her up. There's a simple kind of labelling and acceptance that that's all she is. Then within the last one, again, you remember you get all these kind of time shifts structurally within the novel. The last one that we kind of pick out here, where Mary's kind of they're slum visiting together, so they're going out into the slums to help the people there, to bring them food, and Mary is equated with and here she's kind of depicted in the same way as kind of Marie Antoinette. Why don't they eat cake? As she kind of looks at the poor. Now, again, this is kind of our last view of Mary in the novel, and that makes it kind of all the more interesting the way that Spark kind of deals with this. Now, Marie Antoinette is often kind of quoted as having said this, but historically there's no factual evidence for it. This is arguably sort of an urban myth that's been created around her. And the implication is that the same has been done to Mary, potentially, that people are kind of exaggerate the kind of nature of her. So you get the kind of parenthesis that follows that does the same thing to kind of undermine this perception of her. And yes, it's still a kind of a foolish statement, but it's not as foolish as the kind of initial statement that she's made. What she actually says was, well, why don't they take their clothes to a laundry, when she heard complaints about the prohibitive price of soap. So it does suggest a misunderstanding. It does suggest that she's, not as intelligent, but it also suggests that other people are twisting around her, that she's not necessarily what she's depicted as having been. So Spark, at the close here, does call into question this labelling of her, not to the same extent that Bennett does for a figure like Rudge, but there is this same kind of questioning that goes with it. Okay, so tomorrow I'm just going to build on this slightly before I move into looking at kind of how class comes into this as well. And tomorrow I'm just going to use a couple of bits of kind of secondary criticism that you could work in alongside a discussion of Mary. I've attached them to the email today. So if you want to read the whole article, you can do. Tomorrow, though, I will just give sections of it, so you don't have to, although it would be useful if you have the time to read the whole thing. But it's not one that I'm going to kind of force you to read the whole thing, okay? But for today, people, that'll cover it. So we've got the use of kind of repeated phrases, what they imply about Brodie, the kind of aphoristic nature of a number of those phrases, and we've got the labelling of Mary McGregor, all of which can work into our kind of various different questions in different ways. Okay.